Welcome back to She Talks Green, where we dive into the critical conversations related to climate and shaping the future of sustainability and climate action. I'm your host, Arpita, and today we are going to talk about the impact of climate change in India, how it is changing our lives, how it is shaping our futures, and its journey towards zero emissions, and also how India is stepping up as a global climate leader. Last time we discussed about the COP conferences, but today we are diving deep. We are looking at India's 2070 net zero targets and what that really means for all of us and our futures. How does it fit into the larger global climate puzzle, which we all are trying to solve for? Joining me is my friend and energy expert, Siddharth Singh, from the International Energy Agency. Siddharth has been following climate for many years, and he's here today to help us break down some of those difficult, hard to understand climate jargons, as well as tell us about how India is tackling this challenge of climate change and how we are making progress. Hi, Siddharth. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having me, Arpita.
Siddharth, like I already said, you've been following this journey for quite some time. So I think it's time that we dive into this discussion head on and just start with the basic question. How is climate change impacting India? What are our climate goals and what is this net zero emission strategy that we all are trying to tackle?
Yeah. So the world is getting warmer due to the emissions of greenhouse gases, which are heat trapping gases that are emitted because of our industrial activities, because of the energy that we use. Now, over the last 10 years, the hottest years on record were in this past decade. So, for the past several centuries, the hottest years ever recorded were actually the last 10 years, which is quite striking. So, as we move along, every year ends up becoming hotter than the previous, and this leads to far-reaching impacts socially as well as economically. So India is already facing severe heat waves. We have all read news of heat wave deaths that have happened during election time. There are entire villages that are being emptied out in Rajasthan and Maharashtra during the hottest times of the year. On the other hand, India also faces other types of climate extremes such as floods. We have all seen images of our urban infrastructure being overwhelmed by the amount of rain and its inability to evacuate that water, leading to severe floods in several parts of the country. Of course, there's biodiversity loss, which is very hard to even quantify. Just the amounts of species and flora and fauna that we are losing due to climate change. And of course, there are associated impacts because of the energy that we use. Because every year, 12 to 13 lakh people in India die prematurely because of air pollution. And this is a severe health issue, but it's also an economic issue because it impacts people's ability to spend, it impacts the productivity, and therefore it impacts the GDP or the output. Now, of course, to address this, India has several wide-ranging ambitions in place. These ambitions may have different dimensions and different objectives. But from my perspective, since I work on energy, the one that I follow most is our decarbonization targets. So the main one is to reach net zero emissions by 2070, which means that carbon dioxide, which is the primary greenhouse gas that we consider. So we would like for CO2 emissions from all our economic activities to reach net zero by 2070, which means that it won't reach fully zero because there will be still activities that lead to the emissions of carbon dioxide. But using carbon capture, using forestry, we can ensure that as a whole, there's carbon neutrality. That is the amount of carbon that is emitted every year in India is equal to the amount of carbon that's absorbed or captured, leading to a balance in the carbon flows, and therefore stopping the pace of climate change in the country and pretty much in the world.
I think while explaining all of this, you mentioned certain terms, and that is what we are trying to kind of make it simpler for our viewers, for our listeners. We spoke about net zero. We spoke about decarbonization. We spoke about neutral sort of
Carbon neutrality.
uh, carbon neutrality. What are these terms? I mean, are we using it all in one context? Does it mean something different? If you can help us simplify a little bit.
No, for sure. I think these are terms that people will begin to hear more and more often. It's terms that we will end up using more often. These are terms that will find its way into government policy documents, into corporate communications, and much more. I think we should all familiarize ourselves with what the problem is and what terms we use to actually describe these. So just to take a step back, right? Our Earth is a closed system. So what it means is that the energy that we use as humans, anything that happens due to the use of this energy, any pollution, any form of any externality, we eventually end up facing it back. Like, that is not escaping anywhere outside of our atmosphere and outside of the water bodies that we have and the land we have and so on. So effectively, we suffer the consequences of our own action, and we also benefit from any positive that comes out of it, right? So it's a closed system, and effectively our activities, human activities, are a major contributor to some of these major problems that we are seeing today. So climate change, of course, I think everyone has a general idea that what's happening is that due to certain forms of gases which are able to trap heat or not let the radiation from the sun escape, it's leading to our atmosphere becoming warmer than it has historically ever been. And this is not something that has happened in as modern humans have been around. So in the history of the Earth, if you look back millions of years, yes, the temperatures go up and down, and the amount of heat that is being trapped in the atmosphere goes up and down. But what's happened in the last about 150 years is truly unique. And these 150 years is when industrialization started. This is when we started using fossil fuels in a rampant manner. Of course, we benefited from it. Everything that we see around us was enabled because of the use of fossil fuels. But as a side effect of that, the burning of these fossil fuels led to carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere. And this carbon dioxide, the release of it, tipped the scale from what used to be the balance. Back in the day, before humans came along and started using fossil fuels, as much carbon dioxide as was being emitted, due to, say, burning certain things or breathing and so on, that much was being also absorbed by the trees and by algae and so on. And there was a balance in the carbon cycle on the planet. What happened is that since fossil fuel use led to excessive amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere, that excessive amount of CO2 ended up absorbing more solar radiation, leading to climate change, which is leading to, as we discussed, floods and heat waves and so on. Now, carbon neutrality effectively means you get back to a position where as much CO2 is being released by whatever human use, that much is also being absorbed back. Now, how is that absorbed back? It's absorbed either by forests or algae, and there are other basically natural systems that can absorb it, or because we are emitting so much, we need to also create technologies that can absorb it at a faster rate. So there are certain technologies called carbon capture, and there's a set of technologies, and we can deploy these carbon capture technologies to extract carbon dioxide from the air and effectively store it safely. So that would lead to carbon neutrality and therefore net zero. So that's broadly the nature of the problem and the types of solutions we're looking for.
I mean, this is certainly very helpful to understand all of this very easily. You know, India is an emerging economy, and our PM Modi recently made a statement at a very key event related to energy that this is the biggest bet in the 21st century. Everyone is looking at India. What makes India's role in these climate discussions and negotiations so unique compared to all the other economies and countries around?
I think India has a very critical role to play, and India finds itself in different baskets, or there are different factors that enhance India's importance, right? So, firstly, India finds itself as a part of the so-called Global South grouping. So, Global South grouping is this group of countries that are still developing. And why is it? Because India's per capita emissions, or the amount of emissions that are released by an average Indian, is only one-fourth that of rich countries. So in rich countries, a typical person is emitting 4 times as much greenhouse gases or carbon dioxide as a typical Indian is. Now, the second factor is that while that is true, India is also a large country, right? So, by the nature of its size, India is also the world's third largest emitter of carbon dioxide on the aggregate. So, while there's so many people, all of this put together becomes, makes India a major part of the global economy, and therefore a major part of the solutions to climate change moving forward. And then, as we discussed earlier, India will also have the largest growth in energy demand and therefore CO2 emissions over the next few decades. So, looking into the future, regardless of what may have happened in the past, looking into the future, India will as much be a part of the solution simply because of the nature of our size, of our economy, and just the sheer scale of the country. Now, India has been at once fighting for the rights of developing economies that need some more carbon space to develop. In other words, they need some more budget, the so-called carbon budget, which lets countries effectively use fossil fuels for the development of people. So India at once can fight for the rights of such countries that still have a lot of development ahead of them. But at the same time, because the scale of the India's economy, because it's a modern economy, because it's an economy that that has the technologies of available resources, India is also as much a part of the solution. So India will have to scale up more renewables, as it already is with solar, for example. It will have to scale up electric vehicles. It will have to scale up all other technologies that lead to the reduction of greenhouse gases. So, because of this intersection of India's reality of it being a developing country, but at the same time a large economy that is moving quickly into into a cleaner and more technology-oriented kind of economy. For those reasons, India can kind of find that balance between climate action as well as ensuring that countries get the kind of space they need to develop.
I think this definitely makes a lot of sense because India is also seen as a key voice for the emerging economies, or like you just explained, the global south.
Yeah.
And India has got big development goals, but also major climate responsibilities. How is our country balancing the development needs while still pushing for global climate action? And I think, like you just mentioned, that finance or funding is definitely a key point, and we will get into that, discussion as well. But certainly, I mean, how are we making sure that we are able to balance development as well as our climate goals?
Yeah, so I mean, first we have to understand the scale of what India is setting out to achieve. We are starting from a low base, but India is on track to add 10 to 12,000 cars every single day over the next 2 or 3 decades onto our roads, right? So that's a huge number of cars that are going to be added. India adds a lot of buildings to to its built environment, so buildings in cities and built spaces in small towns and villages, India is expected to add about one South Africa worth uh, uh, built environment to its existing infrastructure every single year over the next few decades. India by 2050 will the electricity demand from air conditioners alone is on track to being as much as electricity generated in the whole of the African continent today. So, right, so the scale of what India needs to do is immense, and there's no doubt that India will need to, find ways to deliver that to its people. Now, for this reason, we expect fossil fuel demand to continue to grow. But at the same time, there's an opportunity for India. There's an opportunity for India to ensure that it is as much a part of the solution and is manufacturing the kind of clean energy technologies that have widespread benefits, not only in terms of reducing emissions, but also in terms of creating new jobs in the country, in increasing the share of manufacturing, and therefore the ability for India to export goods and grow its economy. And at the same time, this will lead to immense contribution in terms of reducing air pollution and reducing the number of deaths, as we discussed, at 12 or 13 lakh people who die every single year due to air pollution. So, clean energy technologies help mitigate and reduce air pollution. Of course, India is very heavily reliant on imported fossil fuels. So, this is one thing that I think, again, clean energy enables India to do to just reduce its reliance on, say, imported oil, which currently is on track to exceeding 90% of our total oil requirements, which is very high. And of course, then also address some of these issues of productivity of labor, of healthcare costs, and so on. So to sum up, there's a big challenge of how India needs to grow, but at the same time, acting on clean energy, acting on the climate, is actually good for the economy, is actually good for the development needs of the country. So I would say it's less about balancing, it is more about using clean energy towards India's development goals. And I think that's the kind of focus and that's the kind of narrative shift we need to see.
I think we all have, read this, and we know that most of the developed countries, they have set 2050 as
Yeah.
their target for reaching net zero emissions that you just explained, that there will be no further emissions happening from that economies. And you just spoke about how India is making some significant progress. But India's target is 2070. And given how much India is affected by climate change, why 2070? Why not 2050? Because we are making some significant improvements, innovations, and sort of progress. So why not 2050?
I mean, yes, it would be great to see India achieve its net zero ambition, as soon as possible. If it can happen by 2050, that would be well and good. But I would argue that India's 2070 goal already is probably more ambitious than the 2050 target by advanced economies, because let's face it, India is, definitely more than 20 years behind advanced economies as far as energy consumption, industrialization, development, and much more. In fact, China itself has a goal of 2065 for net zero emissions, and they are well ahead of India as far as scaling up solar. Just thinking about this, China alone adds more solar every year than the rest of the world combined. And they add more electric vehicles than the rest of the world combined. So they're just able to kind of really scale up on clean energy very quickly, and even they are targeting 2065. Now, I think we should also, kind of think of these targets not as some fixed kind of dates that we will try to reach it at, but it kind of sends it kind of puts, a target that industry, that government, that different administrative units as well as regulators can kind of focus on. If technologies develop faster, then well and good, India can be on its way to achieving net zero well before 2070 as well. I would say that already I think that India's solar PV expansion is on track for India's 2070 targets. India's electric bus sales are also on track. We of course, there's a lot of work to be done. Our coal generation is quite high. Our investment needs are not being met to ensure that India actually gets to net zero by 2070. So there is a lot more work to be done. But I would say that 2070 is already a fair target that can really help channelize our energies and put like this, a target that we can all focus on, and well and good if we reach it before 2070.
You mentioned about how India is sort of also an emerging economy, striking that balance, the requirement of climate finance and whatnot. We hear about climate justice a lot when India is approaching the global climate discussions and negotiations. What exactly does it mean, and why is it so central to our climate strategy and the goals that we just discussed?
Yeah. So the world is obviously a very unequal place, and this should not come as a surprise to anyone.
Yeah.
And there are various dimensions of inequity. Now, I'm not going to, talk about the whole range and basket of inequities that exist. So maybe we can focus on one or two types of inequities, especially that are related to energy use and climate change, right? So, for example, uh, one of the dimensions of inequity relate to historical responsibility, which is that uh, certain countries, advanced economies that exist today, they have used a lot of fossil fuels over the past century and beyond to be able to be able to grow, to be able to ensure that they're able to provide the kinds of services and opportunities for their people. Uh, at the same time, there are countries today that are much poorer, that don't really have they don't really have the same kind of response. I mean, uh, they don't have the same kind of responsibility historically, because they have not yet done that, and there's that opportunity is effectively in front of it, and they have to make those choices. So there's a certain form of inequity that arises due to how we have historically emitted. Now, there is also the case of disproportionate impact. So this is another form, or this is another dimension of inequity, because not all places are equally affected by climate change. There are certain places, India for sure is one of them. Bangladesh, is also another country. These are countries that are particularly vulnerable to climate change. There may be other parts of the world that are less so, but we find that a lot of poorer countries today, countries that are developing, that are emerging, because of the nature of institutions and quality of infrastructure and the ability of the government to respond to extreme climate events, there is a disproportionate nature of the impact of climate change. And then, of course, there's another dimension of inequity is the ability to act. Again, because of the differing, resource endowments and different institutional setups and so on. So there are different types of inequities, which all of them kind of tie to this idea of climate justice, where you'd want to ensure that different groups of people, whether they are marginalized, whether they are parts of countries that are still growing, still developing, that they're all able to benefit from climate action, that they're not expected to do much more than they're able to do, because if everyone in the world was expected to act on climate in the same way, that would actually lead to further divisions, because there are some people who would be less affected by the nature of that action. There are more people who would be more affected by it. So climate justice kind of encompasses these dimensions and much more. And just to broadly understand that these inequities that have historically existed should not be furthered, should not be exacerbated by climate action today, and we should take it into cognizance as we act.
Definitely. Because we were talking about global climate action and how the responsibilities and the impact is not equal in that sense, it reminded me of the 26th COP conference that happened in the Scotland, where Prime Minister Modi gave Panchamitra to the world. What is the story behind that?
So, firstly, I mean, to understand what exactly is it. At the Conference of Parties, which is an international conference on climate change, where countries come in, and under the Paris Agreement that was signed almost a decade ago, countries have agreed that they will give some forms of ambitions and certain targets that they would meet to meet their to meet the global climate action target, to ensure that global warming remains under a certain manageable level. So countries came out and basically gave their set of targets and ambitions that they have. Now, this is the first time that India actually announced to the world, as a part of this of these five key actions. They, for the very first time, India announced that it would work towards net zero emissions. Now, this is striking because until that point, India had been, at least publicly, resisting resisting announcing such a target, because it, again, like we discussed, it puts certain unfair expectations, and of course, countries like India, other developing countries may not be able to reach, may not be able to act without the help of the global community. So there were, several angles that make this quite a bit of a challenge. So for India to go out and announce a net zero by 2070 itself was a major, was a very big act, which I think, pleasantly surprised much of the climate community, and of course it added wind to the sails of the clean energy transition. Now, the story of how this happened, of course, is very fascinating, but unfortunately, I would not be the right person to reveal it, because hopefully someday, when the history of climate action is written in India, this will make for a very fascinating anecdote. I'm sure your other guests, as you speak with them, may be able to reveal a little bit more. But the way we got to this point was very interesting, and I'm really grateful that India, as India basically accepted the need for accelerated climate action, accelerated clean energy transitions, and that was kind of incorporated in these five points that were announced by the Indian Prime Minister in Glasgow.
Maybe in your next book, we get to read about some of these anecdotes, and certainly I'll be fascinated to know more. You spoke about our plans to meet our energy needs with more renewable energy, and India did make some ambitious goals at these global conferences. So we are aiming to meet our 50% of the energy needs from renewable sources by 2030. And India has made some significant strides in renewable energy, like you just said, solar. I think that is certainly a story to be told. And sometime back, PM Modi had also announced the Surya Ghar Yojana scheme. How is India progressing towards its clean energy goals? And for our listeners, if we can just simplify some of these initiatives, how it is really going to benefit me in my day-to-day life, I think that would certainly be very helpful.
Yeah. No, fair enough. Now, clean energy is an all-encompassing term. So it includes many, many dimensions. So I think let's try to break it down and see it sector by sector. It may help us kind of unravel what clean energy means, right? So broadly speaking, clean energy, or energy, use in general, can be understood by a few sectors. So one is power generation. So power generation is critical because everyone uses electricity, and electricity is a key, contributor to greenhouse gases. It is also a key source of energy service demands being met by people, in the form of cooling your home, or driving an electric scooter or whatever else, right? So electricity is very critical. So electricity is one of the sectors. Then you have transport, you have industry, you have buildings. These are the three other major sectors. So Transport is obviously well understood. Buildings includes any use of electricity or any form of energy within buildings, and of course industry finally leads to all other industries where such as iron and steel and cement and so on, where energy is used. Now, if you look at the power sector, power generation, I think this is where India is achieving a lot of its current successes as far as the energy transition goes. So the clean energy expansion in the form of solar PV capacity additions has been rolling along, and I think our analysis shows that we are well on track to the kind of 2070 targets of net zero as far as solar PV capacity is concerned. So we are doing well there. We are trailing a little bit on wind. India actually was one of the first movers. We did really well on wind energy, over a decade or so ago, but we are kind of slowing down on that. I think we need some more fillip for wind energy, especially in offshore, which India obviously has a large coastline, and we should, benefit from the high intensity winds that you see, offshore. So that's the power generation side, and then you have transport. In transport, electrification of transport is a key, way in which you can unlock the clean energy transition. Now, this largely happens if we are able to scale up metros and rail and non-motorized transport. We are actually not doing very well on the non-motorized transport, but one can even argue that India is perhaps too hot a country to expect people to cycle and walk and so on. But at least as far as metros go and electric buses, or just generally buses go, I think there has been obviously a massive expansion in the metro capacity in the country, but I feel that we still need to do a lot more on the buses side to ensure that there's comfortable, air-conditioned public transport available to everyone. And I think that's like a key challenge that India should strive to meet, especially within this decade. Then there is the electrification of cars and motorcycles and so on. India is doing very well on the electrification of buses. India is again well on track for its net zero by 2070 as far as buses go. And three-wheelers, already 50% of three-wheelers being sold in India are electric, which is a massive, win as far as India's electrification strategy goes. And two-wheelers also doing well. Where we are really lacking is electric four-wheelers. In many other countries, already 20-30% of sales of cars are electric, whereas in India it's probably 1 or 2% or maybe even less. So I think that's something that India really needs to again focus on. Then you have buildings. Again, India is doing quite well. India actually has a very strong program for efficiency of buildings. So as far as appliances within buildings go, India is doing very well. But where India is not doing well is ensuring that there is thermal insulation of buildings. So when we turn on an air conditioner, 20 or 30% of the cooling is just lost because our buildings are not thermally insulated, and that leads to a lot more energy demand. And obviously, as far as industry goes, again, we have a lot of coal use in industry. We have a green hydrogen policy in the country, but it's not yet shown much much action on the ground. I think we are still quite some way away from displacing fossil fuels in industry. So to sum up, if you look at the major sectors, India is doing well in a few places, notably solar, electric buses and so on. Where we are really lagging behind is building insulation. Where we are really lagging behind is freight transport, so big buses, big trucks and so on. And where we are really lacking is again industry. So on the net, I think India has a few areas that it will need to focus on over the next decade to ensure that across the board we are moving in the right direction.
These are some key sectors that you spoke about, and we will be, discussing each sector as we move forward in the series to really understand the kind of progress we are making, the challenges, and how, we can quickly transition to our goals. You also spoke about that while we are making all this progress in the renewable clean energy space, We are still very dependent on coal right now to meet our high energy demands. How are we managing the transition to clean energy while ensuring that particularly the mass or the workers that are engaged in these traditional industries or industries like you just said is still very hard to kind of decarbonize? How are we ensuring that while making this transition, we are not impacting their livelihoods or they're not left behind.
Yeah.
And when we talk about these things, this term called just transition oftentimes comes up. So, what is happening in this space?
So, firstly, we have to understand that India has abundant, coal available within the country, and coal is a key contributor to India's energy security as well as energy needs in general. That is unlikely to change anytime soon. In fact, coal use in India is only expected to grow, in the future, including in power generation, but also industry and beyond. So, for example, we expect that over the next decade, the coal use in industry will increase by 50%, and we expect over 50 gigawatts of new capacity of coal coming up over the next decade, and so on. So there is a lot more coal that India is expected to deploy to meet its energy needs. We have to be very real about energy, and we have to understand, for example, that India did try to push for natural gas, which natural gas has about half the emissions of coal, although it is still a fossil fuel. But India tried to push for natural gas. Unfortunately, we don't have enough natural gas being produced within the country, so relying on imported natural gas leads to problems related to affordability. There could be price spikes that impact consumers within the country. There are countries, I can give you the example of Pakistan, which was unable to purchase natural gas during the energy crisis a couple of years ago because of how expensive it was, leading to massive power outages within the country. 16 hours a day, 18 hours a day of no electricity. So India obviously does not want to be in that situation. So India will end up using coal to the extent it can. India's coal use will only get displaced if in the future we are able to continuously ensure that we are scaling up solar, we are scaling up all other forms of renewables and nuclear, and we also have the battery storage and other forms of storage to ensure that this renewable electricity is 24/7, as is obviously nuclear already is. And in fact, we expect that renewable energy generation will cross electricity generation by 2035 or so. So it is about a decade away. So I think this problem of just transitions is at least a decade away for India, and at that point, India will have to start taking it very seriously.
Since we are talking about, how we can ensure that no one is left behind in this energy transition, it's also important to talk about the role of individuals themselves, what they can do, how they can make better choices. Now, there is this initiative which was introduced some time back called Lifestyle for Environment or LIFE, which basically was to encourage the individuals to adopt sustainable lifestyles across India and to help tackle the challenges of climate impact, climate changes. Now, I really don't think a lot of people are aware of what this is, what it means. Does it mean, is it some sort of a subsidy that they have to avail, or is it some sort of an awareness program? If you can help us understand what this is, so that people who are listening in today can actually understand that these are not just some discussions. There are platforms, there are ways where they can also connect better to these discussions and participate in this fight against climate change.
Yeah, for sure. So I think India rightly recognized that clean energy itself will not be enough. Nuclear, renewables, energy efficiency, they're very important and critical for us to get to a point where in the future we will, reduce emissions. But in itself, they may not be enough. That we may need certain, behavioral interventions or choices, and just understanding that eventually energy energy use happens because of the way we use energy. So if we change the way we use energy, that could lead to that would be a part of the solution, although obviously not the whole solution. So we actually did a study on lifestyle for environment, which is which suggests several types of behavioral interventions, including, for example, taking public transport where available, ensuring that we are carpooling, that we are driving, for example, at paces at speeds that lead to the greatest efficiencies, and so on and so forth. So there are a range of behavioral interventions that can take place across economies. This includes, again, for example, recycling of plastic and much more, right? So all of these kinds of behavioral interventions under the banner of lifestyles for environment, we estimated that about 2 billion tons of CO2, 2 billion tons of CO2 emissions can be reduced from such interventions. To give you context, the total global emissions of carbon dioxide is 37 billion today. So after 37 billion, 2 billion can be reduced by such behavioral kind of interventions. And importantly, advanced economies, that is rich countries and in general rich households, will have to do much more, because you cannot expect people who are poor today, who have much less energy use already, to be doing behavioral changes. This is more for people who have big SUVs, and these are for people who fly multiple times a year, and so on and so forth. So if those kinds of interventions can be taken, it has some contribution to play. But it is extremely important to understand that these kind of behavioral interventions don't happen just because of the goodness of people's hearts. It is very important to ensure that there is adequate infrastructure available for people to be able to do these things. For example, you cannot expect people to take public transport unless public transport is comfortable, accessible, frequent, cheap, affordable. So all of these things are very important. So we have to ensure that the enabling conditions for behavioral change do exist. We need to ensure that there are cycle lanes in places that have good temperatures where people can cycle. We need to ensure there is more walkable cities. We need to ensure that there's metro rail and buses that are frequent. We need to ensure that people can take high speed rail between cities as opposed to flying. So those things can only happen with infrastructure creation. And once the infrastructure is provided, then those kind of behavioral changes can be unlocked to ensure that we are able to just get that 1 degree closer to climate action and to a future where emissions are net zero. So yeah, I think behavior does have a role to play, but we should be realistic in expecting who exactly can make those behavioral changes and what kind of infrastructure that's needed to ensure that we're able to make those behavioral changes.
I think you summarized it really well, because when we expect such a big behavioral change, we know we are asking people to probably in the shorter run go through some discomforts, to move to better habits, move to better practices that's good for our environment. But at the same time, we can't be expecting them to do everything and not have the infrastructure. Now, when we talk about building these infrastructure, money again comes into my mind. And money has been a huge sticking point when we talk about climate discussions, whether it is in the country, on all the global conferences, everywhere. How is India working to get the necessary funds for climate action? And this is not just to adapt to the climate change or to deal with the climate change impact, but to also reduce the emissions as we move forward in our journey.
No, for sure. So I think today India spends a little over 100 billion US dollars on its energy, on clean energy, and this needs to more like almost increase by 50% to even double over the next decade to ensure that its long-term clean energy targets are being met. Finding that money, well, India has so far mostly financed it domestically, so it's a lot of domestic. I think over 80-90% of India's clean energy investments come domestically from households, from companies, from governments. moving forward, India will need to ensure that there is more international flows coming in. But the issue is that investors globally want to enter any market only when they see that the riskiness that they perceive is being addressed, that they ensure that their returns are being kind of ensured. And I think for those reasons, India as well as other emerging economies will have to do perhaps a little bit more on, bridging that gap in the perception of risks. I'll give you a couple of small examples. So, if you were to set up, a solar power utility scale solar power generating plant in some African country, and you say you had all the money in the world to do it, and those people, like people living in that country or that region, needed that electricity. So it's a win-win. If I were to invest it, people would have the electricity they need. It would be clean electricity, and I would, hopefully, I would make some money out of it. So it's a win-win for everyone in this particular situation. But there's still a reason why I would not invest, because if I did invest and their distribution company was not able to pay me for my investment because they are unable to collect the bills from the people, and because the people in turn may not have the capacity to pay those bills. So for those reasons, the riskiness is too high. The risk is too high for me to actually make that investment. So there are certain interventions that can be made by governments to ensure that that risk is addressed. For example, you could have certain forms of instruments that ensure that the payment comes to me, regardless of the nature of or the financial situation of the distribution company, or the distribution company itself reforms. They're actually able to undergo financial reforms to eventually get to a point where they're able to meet everyone's, to ensure that all the bills are being paid and collected, at different levels. So I think that is where India finds itself currently. India is in a situation where we have domestically financed our clean energy investment needs. We need more international investment, and to do that, we need to address risk. We have a lot of there could be contractual issues, there could be land acquisition issues, there could be a lot of those. So those kinds of things need to be addressed. And as India is able to do that, we'll be able to get more international flows of investment. But also, just to say that beyond this, the international community too needs to ensure that they're giving adequate amounts of investment and like financial flows towards countries like India, but many others that need this money, and not as loans alone. They have to be in the form of grants. They also have to be extremely concessional loans and other instruments that ensure that it's not all about just the profit motive. The development financial institutions, the governments, they need to look at what the objectives are with as far as clean energy transition go, as far as climate action go, and come up with the financing that is needed for the countries that find themselves in this situation.
Absolutely. I think climate finance is certainly a very critical topic, a critical ask, and we will be diving into it very soon and try to understand, what's really happening in this space. There are some recommendations also emerging with the new, COP coming up very soon. But now let's bring this discussion a little bit on a community or an individual level. For our listeners who aren't really actively involved in, let's say, energy sectors or the climate sectors, this might still feel a little bit of, distant for them. How does India's 2070 net zero goal affect an individual's life? And what changes should they expect in things like transportation, housing, or even saving their energy bills? Because climate action isn't just governments or corporates' duty or just their businesses. There is a role for individuals, there is a role for communities to play as well. And we touched upon this a little bit. But what can we talk about some practical actions, doable actions from our homes, at our work, or in our communities that would help us reach India's climate goals?
So firstly, we need to understand that net zero targets and decarbonization targets impacts everything. It's eventually everything that people do. The everything in every way that the society functions and runs. We use energy, and energy use leads to emissions, right? So, in order to act on this, every aspect of human life will be impacted in some way or the other. And I would argue that most of these impacts will actually be very positive. To give you some flavor of what this means, it means that the nature of vehicle that you travel in, changes. So it may not no longer be the things that you're familiar with, which is using petrol, putting into a car or a motorcycle or a three-wheeler and taking it away. It could change the nature in which you use the vehicles, but it also changes perhaps the need for the vehicle in the first place. For example, if there's better rail transport that's very well connected, like it is in some of the biggest cities in the West or in China and so on, then perhaps the need for vehicles also goes down. Net zero goals also change manufacturing. Exactly what is being manufactured, what are the supply chains needed to ensure clean energy is being, used, and the minerals that are required to make those clean energy technologies. All of those things require a reorientation in the way we manufacture and what we manufacture. So it changes the nature of jobs. It changes the location where jobs exist as far as manufacturing go, as an example. Net zero impacts how you live. It impacts the way cities are designed. We have in many places cities that are extremely that they're huge sprawls with wide roads and large distances that need cars to actually get around. But a city that is more environmentally sustainable, that complies to kind of the net zero targets, they may be more compact. They may include spaces that are more pedestrian friendly, that people are able to get around without having to use vehicles and so on. So it changes the way your cities look, the way your townships look. Net zero impacts taxation. Currently a major chunk of India's tax revenues come from fossil fuels, but at the same time we also subsidize fossil fuels. So if we move towards a cleaner energy future, both the revenues and the outgoes, the subsidies, will both evolve. So it kind of changes your relationship with the state as far as taxation goes, as far as subsidies go. It changes trade. India exports several items, and there are a lot of people who rely on trading to the West and other countries. Now, if in the West they have certain requirements for clean energy or low carbon manufacturing processes, and we are not able to meet them, then it impacts the way we are able to trade with them. So I would say that net zero impacts all aspects of life, but a lot of the ways in which it actually impacts life is positive. There are, in addition to obviously ensuring that we get to a point where there is net zero emission in the future, we see more immediate impacts in the form of cleaner air, in the form of lower water use by the energy sector. We expect cities that are not very hot. We expect thermal comfort. So these are all desirable things. And I think that we need to carefully consider how we go forward, so that the negative impacts that may arise due to trade or relocation of labor and so on, those things are properly managed. But those are obviously long-term concerns. Doesn't concern India at the moment, but we should definitely factor that in. Now, as far as what we can do, what individuals can do, of course, first, just to understand that this is a global problem. Eventually, it will have to be solved at the global level, with the involvement of industries and governments and organizations. So they are really the main movers as far as climate action goes. But yes, having said that, individuals do have a role to play. Households do have a very important role to play. And I would argue that the biggest one relates to actually investment, because households are actually the main vessel for consumption side, that is end use technologies that effectively determine emissions. So, for example, when you're purchasing your next two-wheeler, uh, you know, are you able to find ways to buy an electric option as opposed to one that runs on petrol or diesel? Uh, that's something for us to think about. If you are, buying some form of heating for the houses, in extremely cold places, if you're able to buy heat pumps like electric heat pumps as opposed to gas-based boilers, those are the kinds of decisions that households can make. When you're purchasing an air conditioner or a TV, are you buying the one that has the highest energy efficiency rating? These are the kinds of things that we need to think about. When you have a house, can you paint the top of your house with some heat reflectors so that your AC electricity demand reduces? These are all choices that are made by individuals, by households, and these are the kinds of things that are extremely critical in our ability to get to a point where we are taking climate action, but at the same time improving our own lives. Because many of the things I actually explained are things that benefit us. If our neighborhoods have fewer polluting cars, that's a good thing. If we have more solar households and therefore less coal generation, less air pollution, it benefits us. If we have thermal insulation, our homes or neighborhoods are not as hot in the summers. These are all good things. So eventually households have a major role to play in these kinds of choices, and I think we should fully unlock the potential of that to the extent possible.
Certainly, I think these are some really great suggestions because these are choices that lies with the consumer, with us, and we can certainly find ways to make some smarter choices which are good for our environment. Thank you, Siddharth. I think this was a very useful discussion, and we were able to simplify some of the climate jargon. And I hope that people listening in were able to understand some of these terms that are being thrown around, everyone understands. But hopefully, we were able to help few people for sure. So, thank you so much.